Welcome everyone to LEAP UofT's Rent Strikes and Tenant Power webinar. Thank you all so much for joining us on Zoom tonight. We really appreciate it. My name is Christine, an organizer with LEAP, and your moderator for this evening. Sophia and Julia, if you want to wave. Two other organizers with LEAP will be the chat moderators, and our lovely panelists for tonight are Kate Jacobson, a union and tenant organizer living in Calgary, and Marianne Icaro, a tenant organizing with Keep Your Rent Toronto, a citywide network of tenants formed in response to the COVID-19 crisis. And we're hosting this webinar from Toronto, but we welcome audience members from all over as we learn from our expert panelists about how to return housing and well-being back into the hands of the people. In broadcasting this, it's important that we take a moment to recognize the history and the continued stewardship of the land that supports our communities. The place we call Canada has been inhabited and cared for thousands of years by diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Here in what is known as Toronto, we are part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. This is a treaty that originated between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee, and is extended to all Indigenous peoples and settlers in the region. In the dish with one spoon, the dish is the land with all its resources, and each of us has just one spoon with which to eat. By using the spoon to take only what we need, we leave land and resources for others to enjoy as we all work together to secure the livelihoods of future generations. Notably, the dish with one spoon does not have a knife. Nobody is to cut out a larger portion than they need. There is to be no hoarding of resources or wealth, especially not when others in the community go hungry. And before we jump into this webinar, I'm going to go over a few housekeeping items. This webinar will be approximately 2 hours with introductions, a 1 hour and 20-minute moderated discussion, and a 30-minute audience question and answer session at the end. We're going to have a 5-minute break at 7 p.m. And if you have any questions at any point during the discussion, please type them in the Q&A. We will either ask your questions during the moderated discussion or save them for our audience Q&A session at the end. We're leaving the chat open for attendees to talk to each other and post resources, but please ask all questions in the Q&A. You can find it at the bottom of your screen to the right. And the webinar is being recorded, and a video with closed captions will be posted to our social media, LEAP Chapter UofT. And one more disclaimer, any hate speech or offensive comments will not be tolerated. The chat moderators, which are Julia and Sophia, will ban you if they have to. And with that, I think we're ready to begin. First, can you each introduce yourselves, your work, and how you got involved with tenant organizing? I guess, Marianne, you can go ahead and go first.
Yeah, sure. Hey guys, I'm Marianne. I'm a tenant living here in Toronto. And 2 weeks before April, my partner who I live with lost his job as an event server, and it was looking like I was about to lose work too. And I did, not knowing where our next paycheck would be coming from. We were pretty stressed about having to pay rent, and like other working class people, we hand over most of the money that we make a month to our landlord. And with these precarious gigs that we relied on for income completely gone, we would have to use our savings for rent indefinitely, leaving us with not enough money to support ourselves. And after finding Keep Your Rent Toronto, I realized we could stay put if we don't hand over rent money right now. And we live in a basement of a house, and the tenants upstairs were uninterested in talking to our landlord together. So back in April, we approached our landlord explaining our situation, and the best that she could do for us was like a 2-week deferral, which wouldn't work for us. And I realized we weren't getting anywhere trying to negotiate with her by ourselves. So I started to reach out to other tenants in the area who are also struggling to pay, to strategize on what we could do together and how we could support each other.
And Kate?
Hi everyone, my name is Kate Jacobson. I'm joining you all from Treaty 7 territory in Calgary. I am a union organizer in Alberta, as well as a tenant organizer with a Calgary-based organization called the Renters Action Movement. I also host a podcast called The Alberta Advantage, which is primarily about the political economy of the prairies. I got involved in tenants organizing through a demo eviction that happened in Sunnyside, which is a neighborhood in Calgary. It was the first time I had had experience organizing in a building-based manner instead of working on kind of more generic campaigns. And although certainly if I was to run that campaign again, I would do a lot of things differently, it was kind of my first foray into tenants organizing as a really important spot in which working people can intervene and make changes in our society.
And first and foremost, Marianne, can you tell us what a rent strike is?
Yeah, for sure. So a rent strike is essentially like when a group of organized tenants collectively withhold rent, pressure their landlord to meet their demands. And these demands could look like dropping an AGI, repairs, any issues that tenants would have with like their negligent landlords. And right now, tenants and buildings are organizing these rent strikes to pressure their landlords to commit to no COVID evictions. Some buildings are pushing for a discount, some are rallying around no AGIs. And obviously, circumstances have changed given the surge in unemployment and that people simply don't have the money for rent. And I think Kate will touch on that soon. So withholding rent is usually like, I guess, the final resort of a series of escalation tactics to pressure landlords to come to the table. And I've been learning a lot about rent strikes myself as I've started to organize. And what was really helpful for me actually to see how these escalation tactics are played out in real life was watching a documentary that Parkdale Organize had put out about the 2017 Metcalf rent strike against AGIs.
And we just have a quick question. What is an AGI?
An AGI is essentially when a landlord applies to raise your rent higher than what is legally allowed. And they can say that they did repairs in your building, they put a camera in the lobby, so now your rent is going to be $50 more. And tenants can go and fight this at the LTV by themselves. But in the past, those isolated tenants doing that haven't found any success. And in 2017, those tenants in Parkdale living in Metcalf buildings organized together against AGIs, and they got their landlord to drop them.
And tell us about the basic strategy that goes into making a rent strike effective.
I think it's definitely keeping that communication there, those one-on-one conversations, and just talking to people in real life and meeting those people in real life and having those one-on-one conversations.
And Kate, what does organizing tenants and striking look like maybe on the ground?
Yeah, Marianne said kind of, I think, the keyword, which is one-on-one conversations. When you start organizing, you will hear about these a ton. You will get tired of hearing about them, but they really, truly are an absolutely invaluable tool. And basically, a one-on-one conversation is, exactly what it says on the tin. It is having a conversation with another person. I learned how to do one-on-ones from really wonderful organizers with the National Domestic Workers Alliance, which is a United States-based union for domestic workers. And there are 6 basic principles to doing a one-on-one. The first thing is an introduction, basically just being really upfront about who you are and what you're trying to do. So, if you're trying to organize your building, be really upfront with your neighbors about that and be really upfront with the people that you're working with. The second thing in any good one-on-one is getting at the issues. So this is trying to figure out what matters to the particular person that you're talking to. In tenants organizing, there can be a really wide range of issues. Some people might have issues with landlords not doing repairs in the building. Some people might be being intimidated by landlords. Some people might be facing racism or discrimination from their landlords. Some people might be being gentrified out of an area and they really want to stay in that area because of faith-based reasons or cultural reasons or their kids' school. And finding out what matters to individual tenants that you're talking to is really, really important, because that reason that matters to them is what is going to ultimately motivate people to take the risks of organizing and of ultimately participating in a rent strike that you're asking them to do. The third thing is something we call vision or education. And this is basically walking people through the strategy of what you're doing. Maybe you're all signing a petition to the landlord. Maybe you're having a lobby meeting. Maybe, you've escalated to that point of going on rent strike, but you're basically making a connection for people between what they want and what you're asking them to do. And so often when you're organizing, that might seem really, really obvious to you, like, absolutely, there's an obvious connection between going on rent strike and stopping these AGIs like Marianne was talking about. But for a lot of people, you kind of need to tease out that connection and show people how the tactics you're asking them to do show that they have power. The fourth thing is what we call calling the question or framing the choice. And this is basically the worst part of any one-on-one, which is asking someone a question about whether they'll participate and really letting them sit with the answer. The hardest thing I always find for me to do is when you ask someone, like, are you willing to join us and sign this letter that we are sending to our landlord? You have to resist the urge to be like, but it's totally okay if you don't want to. Or it's like, no worries, like no pressure. You have to let people kind of sit with the choice that you're asking them to make. And hopefully if you've, been developing a relationship with them for a while, or if you really effectively kind of agitated them on their issues, they will be willing to make that choice in a way that helps build tenant power. The fifth thing we do in any one-on-one is something called inoculation. Most people, I imagine, in this panel have been inoculated against something like the flu, which is where you get a small bit of a disease to stop you from getting sick. And this is giving people a small dose of the boss's or the landlord's poison. So when it actually happens to them in real life, it's not a surprise and it's something they can deal with. So this is it feels really counterintuitive to do, but this is walking people through what a landlord might say or do if they find out that you're organizing or that you're doing this. And this is super important because it builds credibility for you as an organizer. And also, a lot of the times, if you're prepared for these things, a lot of intimidation tactics that landlords or bosses might use will fall really flat if you're prepared that they're actually coming. And then the sixth part of any good one-on-one conversation is what we call next steps. So that is basically just making a plan to follow up with someone and also asking other people to do things. One thing that is super common when people start organizing their workplace or their building is they want to do everything themselves because they have a lot of passion, they have a lot of energy, they're really motivated to work on this. But people are much more motivated to join in and to stay organized if they feel ownership over projects and if they're being asked to do things. 90% of organizing truly is following up with people. So even if you're awkward in conversations, you hate talking to strangers, if you can follow up with people, you will be an amazing tenants organizer. It is unfortunately a really, really boring and badly kept secret. But I would say on the ground, that is the main thing that you are going to be doing besides very boring kind of administrative work is just talking with people over and over and over again. So it really just requires patience, and kind of enthusiasm. You just have to do it a lot until you get okay at it and eventually hopefully get good at it.
And because of the pandemic, a lot of people aren't paying rent because they simply can't. Kate, how is this scenario different from tenants who withhold rent because they may be fighting for specific demands?
Yeah, I've seen a lot of discourse about this lately, especially when we were in the first couple months of the pandemic and people were saying like, oh, I think in British Columbia, it was something like 30 to 40% of tenants in Metro Vancouver, for example, were like late on paying rent for it was either the month of April or May. And while I think that is really remarkable and really shows the crisis that we're in, and I think also the lack of the ability for the state to enforce consequences in the way they normally would through evictions is kind of a telling impulse of like that power. I also don't really think that that is a rent strike. I think if I, as an individual tenant, lose my job and I just can't pay rent, so I don't pay rent and I'm being saved through just like a ban on eviction orders, that's not necessarily a rent strike. And the same thing happens, in workplace organizing too, where I live in Alberta. We've had major COVID-19 outbreaks in meatpacking plants, and people from unions who represent those workers have said like, oh, 45-50% of those workers aren't showing up to their shifts because they're scared. That is kind of a strike. And I actually disagree. I don't think that is necessarily a strike if you individually are too scared to show up to work and you don't. I think we should see the strike as a tool of leverage and as a tool of power that we can use to concede demands. Obviously, these are not like two categories that never meet each other. Because definitely, people are going to be more amenable to organizing if they're in a situation where they really, really need to. But for me, I think we should be organizing and working towards using the strike as a tool of leverage, saying like, we're not paying rent until X happens. And often, as Marianne said this perfectly, like, a strike is an escalation tactic. It is not the first thing that you try doing, with a landlord. It is definitely a place that you escalate to in order to bring as many people with you. So for me, it's thinking about how we can use this as a leverage, and also even how we can use the threat of it as a leverage. A coworker of mine works organizing tenants as well in Edmonton, which is also in Alberta, and has had incredible success with, tenants signing group letters to landlords saying like, we can't pay rent as it currently is, we want to renegotiate our rent. And people have gotten anything from $200 a month rent for the duration of the pandemic to significant discounts. And from anywhere from 20 to 80% of the rent they were paying pre-pandemic. And that is way more leverage because you are working with other people and you are actually building power than just individually not paying rent.
And you mentioned workplaces and organizing. How do rent strikes fit into labor and political movements?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm a really big believer in what's called whole worker organizing, which is that absolutely people might be a worker in a certain industry or a certain workplace, but they don't stop being a tenant when they go to work. I don't stop being a woman when I go to work. People who are racialized don't stop being racialized when they go to work. And in fact, the workplace is actually one of the main places in which those oppressions are carried out and in which those things are reinforced and actually created. So I think it is really, really important to integrate these two and to build really powerful coalitions. Mostly what that's looked like in my experience is the sharing of resources. Some movements and organizations are just much better resourced than others, and tenants movements and tenants unions tend to be extremely under-resourced just because of the people that we're organizing. So a sharing of resources there, but also sharing of materials, of tactics, of trainings. Every tenants organizer that I know in Alberta, was trained through the trade union movement. And that is just because the trade union movement has more resources that they can use to train people than tenants unions do. And we really rely on that in order to teach people how to organize. And, I want to make it clear here that this is not just organizations or institutions with more power, like having pity or having charity for tenants, but rather as part of a broader political strategy that says things that are good for workers are going to be good for tenants, because anywhere we can erode the power of landlords and bosses in our society is going to be a really powerful organizing tool. People who are really great tenants organizers are probably going to be great at organizing their workplace and vice versa.
And Marianne, can you describe what's at stake for tenants in a rent strike?
Yeah, for sure. Well, landlords will try to undermine any sort of organizing by pressuring these individual tenants to hand over rent or to agree to a repayment plan. They'll tell tenants that they've been the only ones that are unable to pay rent, or that they've been the only ones who have not signed a repayment plans. They'll scare them with legal threats and eviction notices. So I think making sure that these spaces where tenants can communicate quickly when a landlord does contact that individual tenant is crucial. And tenants organizing in buildings here in Toronto, I've heard, have had success with setting up even things as simple as like a WhatsApp chat group for ongoing communication. But like what Kate said, things are also different for tenants in houses who find themselves the only ones unable to pay rent. Like one unit in a house not paying isn't really a rent strike, but that doesn't mean that we have to stop there and just hope things turn out okay for them, and that their landlord will somehow find the compassion to work things out. And I think tenants in neighborhoods that are predominantly in multi-unit homes or rooming houses can organize across landlords to support those that are struggling to pay rent. And for us in the annex, the support has looked like sending collective letters stating that we're unable to pay rent and that we're sticking together to deal with any harassment from any one of our landlords. Sharing advice, resources, like Kate said, legal information, setting up a flying squad in case a landlord threatens us by showing up at our door. So stuff like that.
And just in case people don't know, what does a repayment plan entail?
So when people go to their landlords and say that they're struggling to pay rent, they have been telling tenants that, oh, okay, well, what we're going to do to solve this is get you to sign this repayment plan saying that you will pay in installments at a certain date. So essentially it's a debt trap, and telling tenants that they're providing a solution when they're essentially just signing them on to debt.
And mom and pop landlords are often discussed to get people to sympathize with landlords. Who actually counts as a mom and pop landlord, and how are they impacted by rent strikes?
Yeah, right. So mom and pop landlords, the ones that are like renting out their basements or part of their house, make up 3% of Canadian households. So it's interesting that the first thing that critics respond with when they hear of keep your rent is like, what about these poor people who are going to have to sell their house because their tenant saw a poster that said keep your rent and are now making the political move to go on a rent strike? Like that just isn't happening. And like these isolated tenants that are most likely to hand over their rent, even if they don't have enough to support themselves or their families, because they are put in these vulnerable positions when they provoke a landlord that lives upstairs. Like they could come down and harass you any time of day. They could threaten to turn off like internet, hydro, or water. But I also think this is why it's so important to start organizing in your neighborhood to try to find these people who don't have rent, because they are in a better position when they reach out to their landlord if they have people to back them up and support them.
And who is bearing the brunt of this pandemic in terms of income instability, and will be in a more precarious position? Tenants paying rent or landlords losing rent?
Right. So rent is the biggest expense that workers have. And having to pay rent is what keeps us going to work. Like the other day in Toronto, the city released a map of the COVID cases in the different neighborhoods. And news data has come out to confirm what us tenants already know, which is that working class people have been hit the hardest. And a larger proportion of people that rent are the ones that lost their jobs. And you can also see in like this neighborhood map that renter districts have the highest number of COVID cases. So it's very clear that tenants are suffering. Many of them are risking their lives as essential workers, and landlords are just losing profit, and they sit in their mansions and claim that we're all in this together.
One thing I think is really important here that clarified how I thought about this is I rent the first floor of a 2-bedroom home in Calgary with my partner and our dog. To me, this place is our home. It's where I live. It's where I cook all of my meals. Right now, it's where I'm working. But to my landlord, this place is a financial instrument, and they expect it to have a rate of return on capital of a certain amount in order for it to be worth it to them as an asset. So those are two very different views of the same place. You know, a landlord, however great they are, however kind they are, the greatest landlord in the world, at the end of the day, your home is a financial instrument for them. And I think we have to stake out the moral position of it's worse for people to lose their homes and to lose the place they live than it is for people to lose financial assets. That is a moral claim that I'm willing to make.
That's exactly right. Like landlords aren't providing housing out of the kindness of their hearts. It's really just business.
And Kate, a common concern people have about rent strikes is that their landlord may evict them for going on strike. How would you address this concern?
Fortunately, I wish I could tell you that the law was super robust and it was amazing for tenants and there were all of these protections, but unfortunately, that is just not the truth. There are very little laws that protect tenants, particularly if they are worried about evictions and things like that. Right now, depending on your jurisdiction, I'm not super sure about Ontario because I'm here in Alberta, but there is an eviction ban right now in Alberta, mainly just because the courts in a lot of places are closed, so landlords can't apply for eviction notices, and the sheriffs who would generally carry out those orders are not working in the same way they would be in a non-COVID-19 time. In general, how I would address this concern if I was organizing is I would be working on building a super majority of people in a building or in a neighborhood who would be willing to participate in a rent strike. And that is how you gain the power in any kind of situation where the laws are stacked against us. And the truth is that for both workers and for tenants, the laws are not really on our side, and they're never going to be on our side. And that's why we have to be honest with the people that we organize, which is, you know, in the labor movement, we say, yes, if you go on strike, your boss can fire you. Yes, if you go on a rent strike, you know, your landlord can evict you. But if we have enough power, it makes it very difficult for those things to happen, you know. And I don't think the power differentials between landlords and tenants are immutable. I think tenants have a lot of power, but it's us paying rent and our participation in the system that allows it to carry on. And when we opt out, you know, that has a really, really amazing amount of power. So from a legal perspective, unfortunately, not a lot of great news I can tell you, but from an organizing perspective, the very real fears that people have about participating in types of action like this, you can work up towards overcoming them. One is by being honest with people. Two is by making sure that you don't take any action like this until you are actually prepared to do it and prepared to protect people. I would never say that two units in a building of 150 units should go on a rent strike, especially when there's no eviction ban, because absolutely they will get evicted. If 60-70% of people in that building are willing to join in, absolutely you're going to have way more power. And the other thing I will say to people who would be concerned about this is that's why it's so important in organizing to escalate tactics. The average person, and COVID-19 has changed things, is not going to be comfortable with a rent strike right off the bat, but by escalating tactics and starting with reasonable things and allowing people to see the way landlords respond or don't respond to reasonable asks and reasonable demands and reasonable tactics is going to make people more willing to participate in something a little bit riskier.
And we just have a question based on the last discussion we had. So when all landlords lose their financial investments, i.e. their properties to the bank, where do tenants live? Marianne or Kate, you want to take that on?
Could you repeat that, Christine? I think I didn't understand.
Okay, so the question was, so when all landlords lose their financial investments, for example, they lose their properties to the bank, where do tenants live?
Oh, right. So this person's trying to make the argument that if the bank owned all of the housing, tenants wouldn't have somewhere to live. What I would say to that? I would say tenants live in their homes, the exact same place that they live right now. And in fact, the homes that are left empty, people who are currently unhoused, which is a major issue here, would live in them. That is, I think, a bit broader of a question about like who should own housing, how should it be provided, what should the percentage of public or social housing be. But I really want to put forth the argument here that if a landlord, let's say you're a landlord and you own 3 buildings and you can no longer afford to rent out one of them, that house doesn't just poof magically disappear into the night. It is still going to exist.
And Marianne, since the Landlord and Tenant Board in Ontario is closed during COVID-19, what other ways may landlords try to take reprisals?
So over the past 2 months, we've seen the tactics that landlords and property managers have taken to try to get people to pay and stop organizing. In Crescent Town, Pinedale representatives went door to door with debit machines, telling people to pay on the spot or max out their credit limits. They told a tenant who had a family member pass away due to COVID that COVID is nothing and that they need to pay rent to keep the economy rolling. In the annex, our neighbors over at 50 Walmer got cease and desist letters from the lawyers of their landlords because they'd put up keep your rent posters in the building. Over at 295 Dufferin, they told tenants who hadn't paid rent that they needed to enter their units for inspection. And it was clear that their plan was just to harass tenants, including a pregnant woman and immunocompromised people. And the tenants at 295 Dufferin were organized, so they set up a plan to quickly set up a phones app and also to block management from entering their neighbors' units. And with that phones app, management got hundreds of calls and voicemails demanding that they do not enter units and try to harass people. And the morning of, they cancel these inspections. So naming and shaming these landlords is effective, and escalating pressure is effective, which we could do through organizing.
And what does escalating pressure look like against these new reprisals?
Right, so I think that's definitely a question that we have here too when we're organizing in a neighborhood, because it's we can't really increase that pressure if we can't convince the other people in our house to not pay rent, because obviously there are those valid fears of landlord retaliation. But in these buildings, they're encouraging other people to withhold rent that can technically pay to pressure their landlords financially, and using what means most to them, which is money, as a financial tactic.
And Kate, can you give us an overview of the rights tenants have with regards to withholding their rent?
I'm not a lawyer or a legal expert, so I will be unable to give super precise advice here. But what I will say is, tenants don't have the legal right in a strict sense to withhold rent. That is because when you are a tenant, you enter into a binding legal contract, with your landlord. Absolutely, I think that there have definitely been some success with like really limited legal mediation. If you are able to have a lawyer and argue that, the landlord is breaking part of the contract by, not doing repairs, not having heating, all that kind of stuff. But the truth is that a lot of the time, the laws are simply unjust. I don't think I'm making a super radical argument by saying that is that laws are meant to protect property in this country, and laws are meant to protect the property of landlords over the right of tenants to a home. And I'm not suggesting, that people just kind of engage in these types of actions, for the fun of it. But definitely, as you escalate, like Marianne and I have been talking about, you are going to run into people saying like, well, it's illegal, to withhold rent. And then that is why you have to really meaningfully escalate to that point in time. There are no, I guess like my main answer to this question is like, there are no like legal tricks. There is no like special asterisks in the law that like give us the ability to like do an amazing speech in the courtroom and defeat landlords once and for all. And unfortunately, the law is unfair. That's something we have to recognize, work around, and deal with.
And Marianne, since many participants may be joining us from Toronto or like that area, what are the rights tenants specifically living in Toronto have?
Right. So in Ontario, there is currently a moratorium on evictions in place, meaning that no eviction orders are to be carried out and that applications for hearings for eviction of non-payment of rent are on hold. So if you're unable to pay rent right now, you could stay put even if you're issued that N4 eviction notice. But like what Kit was saying, there are no legal protections to stop evictions when the LTB opens up. That means that we need to be organizing now and collectively giving demand to landlords to pressure them to come to the table and negotiate a solution outside of the LTB. And additionally, if you are paying partial rent, it offers no legal protections down the line. Landlords can still issue N4s, they can still pursue those evictions. So if you are struggling and thinking of handing over as much as you can in hopes that it'll encourage your landlord to act in good faith later on, you should know that when it comes down to the LTB, it will not matter if you paid even like $1 less than the full amount owed. But in Toronto, there are also local legal clinics that tenants can reach out to for any legal concerns. Or you can email torontokeepyourrent@gmail.com to be connected with a legal professional. And I want to talk more about like those escalation tactics as well, and talk about the landlord visit that we did a couple weeks ago, which I think did spook some of those landlords. A group of tenants from Pinedale in that building where they were going around with debit machines. And also for Starlight, we visited Daniel Drimmer and George Grossman, and tenants as a group delivered a letter with their collective demands and also return notices as an escalation tactic.
And can you just talk about more about the day that people visited landlords' houses? Like, how did that day go? Did you find it effective? And what are the next steps from there?
Sure. So we drove up to Forest Hill where these two landlords live. They're pretty much neighbors. We had signs out. There were some media people there. First, we visited George Grossman, and he did not open the door. The only person that responded to us was a domestic worker that had worked for him, and tenants had given the letter to her, I guess, to pass along. And then we drove over to Daniel Drimmer's house, and he's the CEO of Starlight, and he will be the biggest landlord at the end of 2020. And it was pretty funny because we were standing outside his house and doing our chants, and he has like these automatic windows, and you could see his like automatic windows going up. He sees us and they like come right back down. Some tenants saw him pacing back and forth on his back porch, and he had called the cops saying we are inciting hate speech. But I think that really did did escalate pressure and did spook them. And next steps, I think those tenants are organizing and strategizing on in those buildings. And I think it actually would look more like, it would be more in real life actions like that.
And Marianne, what would you say to someone who is able to pay their rent now and is wondering why they should withhold it?
Okay, right. So every tenant knows their own situation best. So if you feel it is safer to hold on to your money for now, you need to connect with your neighbors, but you can keep your rent and stay put. But the first step is reaching out to your immediate neighbors under the same landlord. In buildings across Toronto, like I said before, like organized tenants are calling on those people who can technically pay rent to withhold that rent until their landlord agrees to their demands, which is no COVID evictions. Um, and what we know for certain is that 3 CERB payments will run out, and that $2,000 just doesn't go very far in Toronto. Like market rent is $2,300, and we don't know when we're going to be making money again for us that have lost our jobs. And for me, it was already hard to find a stable job before COVID. Like I applied to hundreds of Indeed jobs, wait for 1 or 2 of them to get back with an interview, and just take any job that I can get. And we don't know what the job market is going to look like after this lockdown. And I also think that it's not really going to be like people can pick back up where they left off. Like the service industry has been completely wiped out because of this pandemic. Like that job that my partner had as an event server isn't coming back anytime soon. But at the same time, like I said before, like every tenant knows their own situation best.
And Kate, did you want to say anything else?
Not on that specifically, but I did see a question in the chat about something I was just mentioning, which was why negotiate, with a landlord outside of the, I believe in Ontario, it is the Landlord and Tenants Board. In Alberta, it is the residential tenant. We are under the Residential Tenancies Act. I think that's a really, really great question because, in a technical sense, it might not be as enforceable. I know in Alberta, for example, that if you reach an agreement with your landlord outside of that act, you can actually take it to the dispute resolution process there and have it ratified. So that is, one reason to do it. And the other reason is, like I was saying before, is, the dispute resolution process in Alberta under the Residential Tenancies Act heavily favors landlords. If you go there and you are a tenant, you are really, really likely to get just totally screwed over by that system. So, I don't think the concern necessarily of like, how will you enforce any maybe wins you get outside of the system is really valid, because you're not going to get any wins in the system. So getting a win that might be difficult to enforce 3 or 4 months later is absolutely going to be more valuable to you as a tenant or more valuable to you as a building or a neighborhood than never getting any wins at all. It's way easier to build on something that you've already won than it is to, be starting from zero all of the time. So there's both a legal and a non-legal remedy there.
And on Tuesday, Ontario's Conservative government brought forward the Protecting Tenants Bill for a second reading. This bill, also known as Bill 184, aims to speed up evictions by limiting tenants' legal defenses and, in some cases, removing the requirement to hold eviction hearings. Marianne, now that the bill has passed, what does this mean for tenants across Ontario?
It's pretty long and complicated bill. It's like not in plain language at all, but this bill would mean that if tenants are ordered a repayment plan by the LTB and miss a payment, they are no longer granted a hearing and can be quickly issued an eviction notice. So it essentially just expedites evictions for those people that are already in vulnerable positions. And passing this bill has been the only policy response that we've heard from the government, and clearly shows that they don't care about us. And every time that Doug Ford says that we won't get evicted if we're choosing between rent and food, or that he's disappointed in greedy landlords, it's just all lip service, really. There's just no time to wait and see if the government's going to do anything for us, because they won't. We can't rely on the government or the LTB to save us. So, yeah.
And why can't we rely on the government or the LTB to help tenants during this time?
Right. So just like what I said before, because Doug Ford talks out of both sides of his mouth. Like he says that he has that sympathy for us tenants, but the policy just isn't there. There's just nothing that is actually going to be stopping these evictions from happening once the LTB opens up.
And where do we go from here now that the bill has passed? What are our next steps?
Well, I think where we go from here is just to take matters into our own hands. So organize and hold landlords accountable ourselves.
And just a little bit before our break, I'm going to ask some questions that were sent to our Facebook page before the event. So first is, how do we deal with threats from landlords?
I think Marianne has covered this really comprehensively. The idea of building flying squads and being able to pressure landlords who are using tactics of threats and of retaliation is really, really important. I would also take this chance to, emphasize the importance of inoculating people against these threats ahead of time. If people aren't expecting that, people are going to really, really freak out if it happens to them. If I'm a tenant and, an organizer has really sat me down and told me, they're like, hey, here's the thing that's happening in other buildings when people sign petitions. They're going to come try and do inspections into your apartment. And then that happens. I'm going to be prepared for it. I'm going to know that was happening. And it sounds like silly, just like, oh, knowing that something's going to happen to you makes it better, but you will feel way more empowered and able to take it on. And I think it's really incumbent upon us as organizers to, be honest with people. Tenants and workers are not children. They can make decisions for themselves, and we have to be honest with them about the risks and the potential for retaliation. So it's, I think, a twofold tactic there. One is that inoculation piece, making sure people are prepared for it and that they know it could happen. And then the other is thinking about ways to deal with it when it does happen. And the key, the root idea of dealing with any of this when it does happen is showing the landlord that the threats are not siphoning people off from the group. Oftentimes people will pick on they'll pick on leaders within the building, or they will pick on tenants that are otherwise marginalized or in some way. So making sure that there is a really solid response of solidarity there is incredibly important. If you pick on one of us, you pick on all of us. And that is incredibly important in standing up to landlord threats.
And Marianne, can you just quickly go over what a flying squad does and like their role in rent strikes?
For sure. So how we set it up here essentially is like having that emergency chat to say, oh, a landlord is outside my house. Can people come and help me prevent them from entering my unit? And it's pretty much as simple as that. It's just blocking management or landlords from entering your unit when that is not what you want, especially during a pandemic.
And another question from before, who protects tenants without a lease? Oh, Marianne, do you want to go ahead and try to answer that?
For sure. I'm not like a legal professional by any means, but I'm pretty sure if you are living somewhere and paying rent for a certain amount of time, you are still protected under the RTA, even if you don't sign that lease. But again, I'm not a legal professional, and someone should like they could reach out to local legal clinics about that, or message torontokeepyourrent@gmail.com.
Kate, did you have anything to add? And what will happen to tenants who don't pay rent when what will happen to tenants who do not pay rent when the government allows hearings and evictions to occur again?
So obviously the train on this is moving really quickly. My understanding of the current legal ramifications of what can happen now is that once, eviction hearings are allowed again, a landlord can apply for them the same as normal. And then that would be basically like that would go through like a sheriff and the courts and kind of the basic process that it normally does. And it's why it's really important to now be thinking of ways to address this issue. And to not leave it until, you are on the doorstep of something that can be quite traumatic and catastrophic to tenants. So what that would look like is negotiating some kind of repayment plan with your landlord. Maybe that would look like negotiating some type of permanent reduction for the duration of the pandemic. There's dozens of buildings in Edmonton and in Calgary that have actually done that successfully, is negotiating that kind of reduction. So thinking about those things before we're in a position where landlords can use, the power of the state to enforce those things again.
Right.
We have
I'm sorry. And for those tenants that are like in these buildings that are withholding rent that can technically pay, if they do pay the full amount owed before there is any sort of hearing, the problem would go away, and they would have to pay, I guess, the $190 filing fee that their landlord had paid when they did the application. But if you are also issued an N4 and you pay within like the 2 weeks before a landlord can apply the full amount owed, you're also not going to be facing eviction. But for those people who really don't have that money, they will be facing eviction.
And we have an audience question. How do you actually become connected to other tenants if you don't know any of the other people living in a large building? How do you even begin this process of reaching out?
Yeah, this is a really, really great question. Before the pandemic, I would say door knock your building, or at least door knock your floor. It can often, I am a total freak who loves knowing other people. So I do this like when I move into a building, I will just go around and like introduce myself to the other people on my floor, because I know if I want to do any organizing in that building further down the line, it's helpful if they remember me as like the nice, polite young woman who came and introduced myself to them. In COVID-19, door knocking is definitely going to be way more difficult. What I have seen a lot of people do really successfully in Alberta is if you have access to a printer at all, people would print up small slips of paper, just basically saying like, this is my name, I live in like X place. I know like the pandemic is really difficult for everyone. If you need any help, like getting groceries, getting like prescriptions filled or anything, or if there's anything we can do like for you during the pandemic, this is my phone number, this is the email, like feel free to reach out to me. And that is a good way to start making those bonds of connection with your neighbors. The other advice, which is super boring, is just like be really, really friendly. Be like a neighbor from like a sitcom. I'm always just like super friendly to people that I would like see in the elevator, and just trying to get to know my neighbors that way. It's definitely way more difficult in a big building, but I used to live in a building that was 26 stories and had like 18 units on each floor. It was huge. And just like being like really friendly with people in the elevators, talking to their dogs, their kids, it makes it so much easier when you want to talk to them about something political, to have any kind of basic human connection with them. So I would say door knocking in non-COVID-19 times, maybe slips of paper or like some kind of socially distanced connection now that we are in COVID-19, and also just like being a really, really good neighbor.
And Marianne, do you have any other advice or tips?
Yeah, so for Keep Your Rent, like we have those posters ready for people, and we can put like a building specific email or phone number on there as well, so people can directly reach you in your building. And I think I've also heard that people are also tabling, so essentially just setting up a table in the lobby and talking to tenants that come in and out has been successful.
I love that.
Yeah.
And we have a question from the chat here. It says, I noticed the Toronto Keep Your Rent demands have changed from complete rent forgiveness to no COVID-19 evictions. Marianne, do you want to comment on this as an organizer with Keep Your Rent?
Sure.
Did she freeze?
She froze.
I'm afraid I can't help with that because I don't live in Toronto, but yes, Marianne is definitely frozen.
Let's see. Where can I message her? And as Marianne tries to get back to our panel, Kate, can you describe the differences between organizing in neighborhoods and organizing in buildings?
Yeah, absolutely. Organizing in buildings is a lot easier, which is a huge bummer to me as someone who no longer lives in a building and who instead, lives in a single family home in a neighborhood. The reason organizing in a building is easier is that you have a bounded constituency. This is, I think a labor term. That's the first place I heard it, but it's basically where you have a really specific number of people that you're trying to contact, and therefore you have really obvious metrics of how good you're doing. So, you know, if I'm organizing a workplace and there's 170 people who work in that workplace, and I know there's going to be a vote on union certification, I know I have to get 50% plus one, and I know the exact people that I'm trying to reach. The same thing is true in a building. You know, if I live in a 7-story building, there's 8 units per floor. I know there is 56 units. So, I need to make sure that I am building a super majority of those 56 units. So, you know, you're probably aiming at 30 plus units being on board with whatever you're doing, whether it's a petition, a phone zap, any kind of thing like that. And that makes it a lot easier. In neighborhoods, that constituency isn't as bounded. It definitely is to a certain extent, just because, you know, neighborhoods are only so big, there's only so many houses there. But definitely, absolutely, you know, you have to be a lot more specific and concrete about defining like who exactly in the neighborhood that you are trying to talk to. Neighborhood organizing can also be a little bit easier in some ways because, you know, you just have more people to pull from, and it can be easier to have a public presence and things like that. But in general, I would say whether you're organizing in a building or in a neighborhood, you are going to want to have basically just like a really good idea of like how many people you are trying to reach. And I'm actually seeing a very good question because I've used the word phone zap a lot in this, and so has Marianne. A phone zap is when you have a specific period of time and you call someone, usually a landlord, a property management company is super common, and you basically just have a really polite like set of demands. And by concentrating that into a small period of time and having people do it repetitively, it serves two purposes. One is that it's way more difficult to ignore. You know, tying up the phone lines of a property management company for an hour or two in the afternoon actually is a fairly significant disruption to their business. And two, it's also a great way of tracking who in a building is participating in an action. So if you're in that 56 unit building that I used as an example earlier, and you can get, you know, 40 of those units to participate in a phone zap, you're tracking basically what people are willing to do to exercise the demands that you are trying to express. Every time I explain, I feel silly because it sounds really basic and people are always like, how could phoning someone like possibly work? And like, there have been a lot of issues that like have been completely solved with a phone zap. A lot of landlords and property management companies don't face any pushback on these things that they do. So getting any kind of pushback, even in the form of like a phone zap one afternoon, sometimes that is enough to make a landlord or a property management company just truly be like, you know what, you can have repairs in your unit. We will stop pursuing X thing. So that's what a phone zap is.
And all right, it looks like Marianne is back. And now that Kate's done answering the question about a phone zap, Marianne, did you want to go back to talking about why Keep Your Rent changed their demands from rent forgiveness to no COVID-19 evictions?
Sure. Sorry about that. Yeah, my internet crapped out on me. But the demand no COVID evictions still means no rent, like no repayment for rent. Because essentially, if these people that are struggling to pay rent go to the LTV, they will be seeing these repayment plans, and if they are not able to commit to that, they will be evicted. So no COVID evictions kind of brings that all together. And I also think that for the buildings that are organizing, they wanted that messaging to be clear because they were telling people that we're kind of uncomfortable with the fact that they are not going to be paying rent forever, to just say that, please, like, can you withhold your rent until the landlord meets these demands and commits in writing no COVID evictions.
All right, and I think this is going to be my last question before the break. It's another question that was sent to our Facebook page. Is it possible to organize an efficient rent strike without knowing the tenants of the many units the landlord owns?
It really depends. If you're in a building, I would say no. This can pose a lot of challenges though. If I've lived in like condo buildings where you're in a building, but everyone has a different landlord, which poses another set. I would say very good chances you are going to have to know many of the other like tenants in order to organize an effective rent strike. Mary Ann might be able to talk just because I know their experience is so much in organizing in lower density areas than mine is. But there are ways to get this information, especially if they're using like any type of property management company. A lot of the times you can find this information also, sometimes it's publicly listed. Again, I'm not sure about Ontario, I'm sorry, on landlord and tenant boards and things like that. So you can often find out small pieces of information like that. I haven't come across any like really good tactics, unfortunately, for getting the contact information of like other tenants that a landlord owns. Oh, sometimes on rent websites like Rent Faster or whatever, you can like look up like your landlord's profile and it will show them as kind of other places come onto the market, but that is very, very time consuming. So I am also very interested in what Marianne has to say, because unfortunately this is not something I found a really good workaround for.
Yeah, I don't think there is any way that you can get like a list of tenants at their other properties, but there are those online resources. I think there's one called like Tenant, where you can see where their other properties are. But I feel like a way to reach out to those tenants is potentially flyering in those buildings and putting up posters with contact information where they could reach you.
All right. And, if no one has anything to say, I guess it's good to we're good to take a 5-minute break now. We'll see everyone back right at 7 p.m. All right, welcome back everyone. We just have a few more questions before the audience Q&A session, so I'm just gonna go right into them. And Marianne, as a tenant organizing in the Annex neighborhood of Toronto, could you give some organizing tips to those living in lower density neighborhoods where they maybe aren't living in the same building as their neighbors?
Yeah, so for our neighborhood, we created like an annex specific email and phone number to put on our posters. And then we've also been calling tenants who signed up for Keep Your Rent through the Facebook group and have indicated that they live in the area. So I was thinking actually earlier to when we were talking about reaching out to other tenants of these different properties, a great resource that Keep Your Rent has put together is pretty much having that sign up sheet there and linking those tenants together in different areas that are of the same landlords, or linking tenants together of the same neighborhood to communicate with each other. And so we're calling these people and we're essentially just asking how they're doing, if they've been able to pay rent, and to see what the support they would need. We've organized across landlords and sent letters collectively on May 1st and plan to communicate with landlords through that email as we see fit. But organizing is hard. It takes some time to really build something. And as we were talking about before, those one-on-one conversations on the phone, since we can't really be doing that in person as much, are much more effective than like emails and texts, even if it seems daunting at first. And it would be impossible to get every tenant to collectively not pay rent together as a neighborhood. And for landlords, they don't really care if a tenant over there isn't really paying rent. Like, they only care if they get their money. But that doesn't mean that we can't organize together and support each other to defend against landlord retaliation, but we'll need to strategize other pressure tactics to actually get landlords to come to the table.
And during the break, we had an audience question, so I'm just gonna go ahead and ask it. Do the panelists have recs for how to frame rent debt, rent debt amnesty policy demands in a way that holds up against pushback, i.e. the implementation mechanism is smooth and doesn't confuse or exclude people, and doesn't fracture tenants along the lines of who already has paid debt down versus who hasn't?
Right. So, what I am getting from this question is that it's a concern around ensuring the universality of any kind of rent amnesty forgiveness program. And the analogy that was used by this person, I think, is really apt, where it's the same argument you get against free post secondary education, which is like, how is that fair to people who have already paid? So I think a big part of that is being open about this being a demand from the very beginning. So people who might be closer or have more ability to pay are able to make those demands. For implementation, I don't have a ton of amazing ideas because I am not a policy wonk. But I think making sure that the demand is framed in a really universal way is really, really important going forward. So it could be something like anyone who has lost their job does not have to pay rent or has rent debt forgiven. Even if they've paid X amount of it or X percentage of it after COVID-19. I think the other bit here is about like reporting requirements, and this is always a really big challenge in making sure that the way in which people interact with these bureaucracies isn't alienating, especially for like people who are unhoused, or people who don't have permanent addresses, or people for whom English is an additional language. It can be really, really difficult. I think that if we ever get into a position when these demands are able to be actualized on, I think what is going to be really important is ensuring that if these demands end up being actualized on by governments, that tenants, groups, and organizations don't kind of let up the pressure or let off the steam there. I'm sorry I couldn't be more helpful for that question, but I think it's a really good thing to think about, and it certainly gave me a lot to think about how we kind of articulate this or implement it in a way that's not exclusionary.
And June 1st is coming up in a few days, which means that rent is due for many people. Marianne, how can our webinar attendees support you and other organizers in the lead up?
People can help support tenants by printing out and putting up those posters in their area, which you can find on the Keep Your Rent website. And anyone can take part in the phone and emails apps. Sometimes people are hesitant to participate in the phone's apps because it seems confrontational, but you just turn off your caller ID, follow the script, and hang up. You don't even really have to listen to what they have to say. And at some point, they usually stop picking up, so you just leave a voicemail. And these are pretty spontaneous because they're just like a direct response to whatever landlords are doing at the time. Like today, there was one against Timber Creek because they sent letters saying that they're going to be entering people's units to confirm occupancy. So just to harass you for rent. So there was a phones app today for that. And there's going to be an in-person citywide action taking place very soon. So to stay posted on that, you can join the Keep Your Rent Facebook page.
And Kate, how can people who aren't tenants, for example, homeowners or members of housing co-ops, support rent strikes?
This is a great question, and this is something I think about a lot because where I live in Calgary, only a little under 30%, somewhere around 26% of households are renting households. So it is much different to Toronto, which I know has a much higher rate of home ownership. And for us, it's super important to build bonds of solidarity between homeowners, people who live in housing co-ops. For us, we define a tenant as someone who does not have control over other people's housing. So, if you're not a landlord and you don't have control over another person's housing, then you are very welcome into any kind of coalition. And I think there needs to be a real acknowledgement that a lot of the same forces that really harm tenants also harm a lot of homeowners, people who have gone into supreme amounts of debt to own their home and who use it as leverage for retirement, for paying for their kids' college, things like that. There's a real meaningful way to build solidarity there. So I would say the first thing there is making sure that you're explicit about welcoming people who do not have control over other people's housing into your organizations, if that is a step that you have decided to take. And the other thing is having small actions like Marianne was talking about that these people can plug into. And it actually has a lot of impact, especially if you're doing any kind of advocacy or campaign oriented work around changing laws, to have people able to phone a city councilor you're trying to pressure or something and say I'm a homeowner and I support X, Y, and Z. And also just as always, having more bodies for phones, apps, all that kind of stuff is really, really incredibly useful. You will never run out of things, unfortunately, for people to do. For housing co-ops, that is a situation that I am way less familiar with, just because Alberta has a really low rate of housing co-op participation, especially as compared to Ontario and Quebec. And definitely the other things that I said go across there, but I would be interested if Marianne has anything specifically on housing co-ops or how Keep Your Rent Toronto has worked with housing co-ops.
Nothing really directly, but I've been talking to some of the people that do live in co-ops around here in the annex, and what they had chosen to do was to create a letter of solidarity for the Keep Your Rent tenants and any tenant that is unable to pay rent, and essentially just publicize any actions that are happening, and to encourage that participation in any phone or email apps that are going on.
And Marianne, what first steps would you recommend to someone who wants to begin organizing in their neighborhood or get involved with organizing already happening?
Yeah, the first step is to always talk to your immediate neighbors. So in your house, that would mean the other tenants in the house. And if you're in a building, that would mean the other tenants in your building. And like I said before, I've heard that tenants in buildings are using WhatsApp groups to keep tenants connected. You can put up those posters with the email for your specific building or neighborhood with that phone number as well. And tenants are also reaching out with flyers and setting up those tables in the lobbies to talk to the tenants that come in and out. I'm not organizing in a building, and I'm sure that comes with its own challenges, but for specific pointers on how to have those one-on-one conversations from people who are organizing in these buildings, I think they're more than happy to chat about that, and you could reach out to them in that Facebook group. But really just make those calls and talk to real life people. And I think that it's also important to remember that organizing isn't some sort of abstract concept. It's really just something that working class people can do on their own. I haven't been involved in any sort of organizing like this before, and I'm not some sort of professional. I'm just a concerned tenant, and I've been learning on the way, and I don't have the answers to everything, but with Keep Your Rent, I could reach out to other people that may have the answers I'm looking for. So it's never too late to start organizing.
And do you have any specific recommendations for students who are struggling to pay rent?
I think pretty much what we've been harping on, which is just to talk to your neighbors and to organize, really.
I did some of my best tenants organizing when I was a student because I had way more free time.
And as that was my last question for you too, I think we're gonna just jump right into audience Q&A. It's a bit early, but we have a lot of questions. So my first question would be, what are some intersections between housing justice and decolonization?
Awesome. I love this question. And the reason I love this question is that I think the root of housing injustice in Canada is colonization and the process that we would call, the enclosure of the commons. Basically, the idea that people could carve off and have specific private property that they were able to leverage over others in order to extract rent from other people, and that happens both to businesses and to tenants as well. So I think that is decolonization is a very important part of tenants' work because that is the root of the system that we currently exist and organize against and organize under. I also think for me in my work is being really cognizant of the specific issues and challenges that Indigenous tenants have when they are organizing. In Calgary, we have done a lot of organizing work around we don't have any type of rent control in Alberta. So often what will happen is Indigenous families move into a building and some landlords are extremely racist and they will try and double or triple the rent on that family or on that people in order to ensure that Indigenous people are not living in their building. So building meaningful solidarity through just like seeing the intersection of, how colonialism and tenants' rights work intersect is really, really useful there.
And we have a question from the chat. What are the drawbacks or risks of joining a rent strike? If my landlord files for a hearing, will I have to pay fees? And will my credit score be impacted?
I'll let Marian take the bit about a hearing just because none of the groups I've ever worked with have ever got to a hearing phase. It can impact your credit score depending on what and if your landlord files. I would say I know that this panel is about rent strikes and I know that the main thing that is on everyone's mind is rent strike, but I would say I have worked on dozens and dozens of successful and some not so successful organizing campaigns in Calgary. The friend I mentioned, Edmonton, has organized 17 buildings since COVID-19 began. And none of them have actually got to the part of actually becoming a rent strike, even places where we were dealing with really, really serious issues. But definitely, yes, your credit score can be impacted. I would say one of the other big things is a lot of the time when you apply to live in a place, they will ask you if you have been previously evicted. And that is something that you would have to disclose or that they could probably find if, I guess you could lie. I probably shouldn't give that advice. I don't know how. I was like, you could lie. Your landlord would have to go to the courts in order to find that out. I'm not sure how thorough most landlords are in checking in on their tenants, but it's definitely something to consider. Is that is often a question on tenant applications for if you are moving or living in a new place.
For sure, and I can touch on maybe like what happens when you're in Toronto or in Ontario and you're unable to pay rent, and it comes down to that hearing. But so if you are unable to pay rent, your landlord can issue that N4 notice. And if you pay up within the 2 weeks of that notice being issued, they can apply for a hearing. So let's say you waited that 2 weeks and you still haven't paid the full amount owed. You can wait for whenever that hearing is. If you pay before that hearing, you would pay the full amount owed plus the filing fee, which I believe is like $190. And let's say you do go to the hearing, what's most likely going to happen at the LTB is they're going to order some sort of repayment plan. If you don't stick to that repayment plan, I guess Bill 184 will say that you're going to get immediately evicted. But also, when that eviction order is there and when that landlord has that judgment, for it to affect your credit score, they would have to go to small claims court and convert, or whatever legal term it is, that judgment into a small claims court judgment, and then apply for a credit bureau to affect your credit score. So it's a pretty long process, and it's not really gonna happen out of the blue. Like, you're gonna be pretty aware of that happening.
We have a similar, not a question that's kind of in this realm of discussion. What's the biggest hurdle to rent strikes, and what's the hardest part?
The hardest part is everything, but no. In all seriousness, the biggest hurdle to rent strikes is building a collective of people who are willing to take action together, and that is because we live in a society that encourages us to think of ourselves as individuals, and we live in a society that structures us to interact with the world around us as individuals. And one of the tasks of being a tenants organizer is that you are trying to get people to see that I have this personal problem that is personally impacting my life, but it is a political problem that is also impacting other people. And the reason this is so difficult is like, our society is not structured to encourage people to work in collectives, but also because landlords and our bosses are really good at, treating people as individuals and siphoning people off from the group. A really big challenge in organizing a lot of buildings is sometimes tenants will have very racist ideas about other tenants and will not want to work with them. That is something that happens, and that is a huge barrier to overcome with solidarity. So, you have to set like extremely firm ground rules to make sure that there is like no racism in that space. Otherwise, you are going to exclude a giant group of people from being able to participate in that collective and build strength with you. Or, landlords will go up to some tenants and they will try and cut deals with individual tenants. They will say, oh, like, you've always been such a great tenant. You've been here a long time. Like, we're going to do this for you, but we can't do it for everyone. So really encouraging people to think of themselves as individuals. So without a doubt, I think the biggest challenge is actually forging that collective. Tenants do have things in common, but we live in a society that makes us think that isn't true. So the political education, the organizing it takes to get there is a massive undertaking.
Marianne, do you have anything to add?
You laid that out really great, Kate. And pretty much just getting those tenants to move as a group and act as a group is what you want to happen. And that could even look like telling these tenants that, when that landlord does reach out to you individually, you can say, you've been sent a letter from our tenant group, you need to respond to that letter, and that's it, instead of having to, and letting them know that they don't have to give all that financial information or records of employment that their landlord is asking them for, and pretty much just, moving together and moving forward as a group.
And just going to take some questions from the Q&A part. What should a letter of notice to a landlord look like / contain?
Some basics are that it should include contact information, a way to get back to people. Oftentimes, this is a really great way to leverage an organizer from outside of the building to be a point person. In my work in the labor world, we do this all the time with different bargaining units. We'll have different bargaining units call the bosses of other bargaining units, and that works really well because people are less liable to face repercussions if they're not in a direct relationship with that person. So I would say that can work. But basically, it should have your basic, it should have your basic demands, and then it should have a timeline. And basically saying this is when we expect to hear back from you. Make sure it's a reasonable timeline. And then I also like to say, this is what we are going to do next if you do not respond to us. Also, I think sometimes tenants organizers, especially if you come to it from left-wing politics, which full disclosure, that is how I came to tenants organizing. We tend to really romanticize or valorize the sort of aesthetics of what we think like a tenants movement should look like, or a demand should look like. There is really nothing to lose, and this took me a while to learn, from being extremely polite to landlords at the beginning. The first letter you write to your landlord should not be screw you, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. It should be this is the situation that we're facing right now. This is what we would like to see happen that we think is reasonable, and then just have people sign it. And the more reasonable, a lot of air quotes on that word, you are at the beginning, the lower the barrier for participation is going to be to most people, and the more room you give yourself to escalate. Even if you start with a tactic that is pretty middle of the road, like a phone zap, it doesn't give you as much room to escalate than if you start with a letter and then escalate to a phone zap. So I would say, basic demands, a time to respond by, be super polite, make sure you have contact information.
And another question, how can those of us who have family members or friends who are landlords broach the subject gently and encourage them to listen to tenants, reduce rent during the pandemic, among other things? Oh, anyone want to take the lead on that?
Go ahead, Marianne.
I think it definitely depends because it's like, well, if they are in a position where they are not going to be losing those homes if they miss a couple $100s in rent, they should consider taking that choice. Like there have been landlords in Toronto that have waived rent for people, so it's not unreasonable at all. So I think definitely just talking about how these tenants are really struggling and how that money just really isn't there. So demanding for it to come in isn't going to be helpful, and to threatening them with eviction or throwing them out on the street during a pandemic isn't compassion or like a show of sympathy at all.
Yeah, I think unfortunately, the best way to broach that topic is going to be making a moral argument. And, maybe this is woefully naive of me, but I think most people want to think of themselves as moral people who will do the right thing, who are good people. So encouraging that moral framing of it, as opposed to, a financial or an economic framing, I think is really important. And my other thing I would say is, if this is someone that you like have a long time relationship with, be really patient and really kind, and try and be like really understanding, even if people in your mind you're like, I'm hearing the worst thing I've ever heard in my entire life. Being really patient with people will pay off in the long run. It definitely might take a couple weeks of conversations with someone before they're willing to cut their tenants some slack. Absolutely.
And we have another question. Looking for some positivity, can you share some organizing success stories? What are the joys of organizing tenants? Marianne, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. So with those phones apps, they've been pretty successful in getting landlords to not enter those units, and getting landlords to stop harassing tenants daily. But I think that success is still ongoing, and it's like playing out as we speak. And there are going to be some actions coming up. So we're still kind of seeing how it's all going to play out.
The biggest ones I've already mentioned on this chat were reductions in rent for the duration of COVID-19, which was a really, really substantial victory. And then I've also been involved in some work about getting repairs done in buildings, and that was also really rewarding. But I think in general, beyond kind of those really specific victories, the main joy of tenant organizing for me is that people will always like really surprise you. Sometimes it happens in bad ways. Like sometimes you thought people you could rely on in a building will turn out to be like flaky, or will kind of not come through. But also, like, you will meet through this process people that are not part of your social circles, who are not part of your like coworkers, things like that. And the bravery of people will really, really profoundly humble you. I would say that is my main experience in organizing, both in the labor movement and for tenants, is what people are willing to do, and the risks people are willing to take, not only for themselves, but for their coworkers and their neighbors, is really, really remarkable. Solidarity truly is like a force stronger than gravity, and seeing what people are willing to do is amazing. I have door knocked in buildings for rent strikes and have people say to my face, I can afford to pay my rent, or like, this issue doesn't bother me and I'm willing to go on rent strike for my neighbors. Like, that is such an amazing feeling, is to see someone who's really internalized, like, I am part of a collective, and when we're stronger together, and when other people hurt, I hurt. And that is such a rewarding and amazing feeling. I never get tired of it. I get a rush every single time someone says something like that to me.
Yeah, exactly. Like just meeting new people and being connected to like my neighbors who I've never met before. And honestly, it's kind of funny that it's like happening during quarantine. And but yeah, like just meeting those people and like meeting people that are also willing to organize, that's very motivating.
And for those of us who do rent from small-time landlords, like the mom and pop landlords we talked about earlier, and have a good relationship with the landlord, is there a concern about souring the relationship post-pandemic by going directly to withholding rent?
Yeah, I mean, I would say don't go directly to withholding rent. I know many people are withholding rent truly because they have no other options, and that's COVID-19. But I would also say, if you have a decent relationship with your landlord, maybe it's 2 units in a house and you both kind of like your landlord pretty well, I would start by like writing them an email, CCing your neighbor on it, and just like approaching them and saying like, look, here's the situation we're in, and like here's where we can go. This is not like very radical of me. Some landlords are reasonable. I have worked with tenants in buildings where like that has gotten results. People are just like, okay, this is what we can do, and the tenants are like, you know what, that works for us. Some people are going to be like Marianne's situation, where they're just going to be like, no, like there's going to be a hard no. They won't want to talk about it. They'll offer something that is not helpful at all. But like, definitely, absolutely, do not go to rent strike right away. It is a big step. The consequences are so incredibly real. It can ruin your credit score for years to come. It is not something that should be undertaken really like lightly, and it is not something that should be undertaken without trying tactics that have less risk first. I'm definitely not saying never do it. It can be really successful. It can be really powerful, but don't go to it off the bat for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Just talking to those neighbors in the house first before approaching your landlord and doing that communication together.
And what do you recommend to those simply supporting the rent strike, withholding rent, when it comes time to go to the tribunal?
I think that's definitely a conversation that people are having in those smaller groups of organized like neighborhoods or buildings. So that is a decision that they're making together, and so it's really just up to them.
And rent strikes, housing as a right, etc., aren't new things. Have there been any big rent strikes or major organizing in Canada or North America historically? What were the outcomes?
Oh yeah, there has been loads of very successful tenants organizing in North America. A lot of it in New York, in Los Angeles, in Kansas City, actually, believe it or not, Minneapolis, all have had extremely successful ones. A lot of them are historic. They took place in a time that I actually think is maybe quite similar to what we're going through now, which is the interwar period. Depression and disease, which are two things that we're really experiencing right now. And I also want to make the point here that in places where they have had very large scale successful tenants movements. I was born in Britain and I grew up in the UK, and there's a very successful tenants movement there, particularly in Glasgow. There is kind of a living memory of sort of like tactics and organization that you can really build upon, even for things that happen outside of our lifetimes, that people can draw on for inspiration. So I would say, even if necessarily what we're doing right now isn't successful, the experience of people of organizing and talking about these issues and making these first attempts is incredibly important for kind of a trajectory of moving forward.
And are there any sort of common myths about rent strikes you'd like to address? I'm sure you guys have seen some pretty bad Facebook comments about strikers/organizers, or news stories that frame rent strikes as reactionary / immature and uncaring towards landlords. How do you respond to these kinds of comments?
I've seen those comments, just calling people freeloaders and et cetera, but it's like, this isn't like a decision that's lightly made. People are making these decisions together, and there isn't some sort of broad call to action, don't pay your rent and that's it. It's don't pay your rent, or organize with your neighbors and don't pay your rent if that's what you all collectively decide to do. So I think with those comments, I don't know, sometimes they don't even need to be addressed.
So the way I think of a lot of these people, and some of these specific things that are said that are just like truly nasty, like people who won't pay their rent are like freeloaders, things like that. I was taught in thinking about the spectrum of people who will agree with you is like, there's people who like are committed, yes. There's people who are like who are like committed and they agree with you. There's people who are not committed and they agree with you. There's people who are not committed and they disagree with you. There's people who are not committed and they disagree with you. People who are committed and they disagree with you are just like a total lost cause.
Right.
Maybe this sounds really harsh, but you should just like completely ignore them and try and just like marginalize and ignore them. Someone who is spending like hours a day on Facebook posting about how like tenants are freeloaders, they're not coming around. Maybe your uncle who like is like, oh, I think people should pay the rent, but et cetera, et cetera. Like that is someone who like can come around with a little bit of work. That is someone who is not like fully committed to the idea of like tenants are bad people, but people who are like committed to opposing you, I do not think about them. I think about how much power they have and how I would like to build the power to counteract them, but I honestly don't think about ways to engage with them because I don't think that is super possible. And I think another really important part of demystifying rent strikes and kind of counteracting these myths about rent strikes is also just making a lot of tenants organizing really positive and really forward thinking, so people's interactions with it and people's experiences of it are positive and are good. It's really difficult if you're a tenant and maybe like you read a news story about like how rent strikes are really uncaring, but the only person you've ever talked to about it is someone in your building who's like very nice and friendly. That does a lot, like more than you would think, to undercut those types of ideas.
And another question from the chat, it's long, but I'll power through it. Many believe, as I do, that there will be an opportunity for tenants to want to be homeowners to be able to get on the property ladder if they choose when the inevitable crash in housing comes. If the rent strike damages credit ratings, this could impact those tenants who will need a good credit rating to get a mortgage on their first home. My concern is the rent strike may impact those potential new homeowners if their credit rating is damaged. Have the organizers weighed this complication when they ask the tenants to join rent strikes in solidarity, even though they can afford to pay their rent?
Absolutely. This is something that you are going to want to talk through and inoculate an individual tenant against. Someone like me, I have a very good job, so I'm very like inured from this, and because of that I have a very good credit rating. I personally could take the hit to my credit rating if I was in a building that was rent striking and I wanted to join in solidarity, but that is a personal decision that I would have to make in conversation with an organizer. I'll go back to what I said about one-on-ones in the building. Like there's always going to be a million and one reasons to not participate in a rent strike, to not participate in a strike in your workplace. And that's why it's so important to talk with people and to frame what you're asking them to do in relationship to these things, in relationship to having solidarity with their neighbors, in relationship to any issue that they might be facing. And I'll also say, like, I see another question that's like, how should we deal with tenants that choose not to join in the rent strike because they don't face issues? I mean, if you're in a building, like, I think that's really different. But if we're talking about just like a general rent strike because of COVID-19, it is my belief that like tenants are not organized enough right now to have just like a general rent strike of like every single tenant like not paying rent. I think that is an amazing goal to work towards. I think we should be working towards it, but we also have to be honest with ourselves and say we don't have the organization or the capacity to organize that at the moment, and that's why there's so much focus on this building to building and building capacity one at a time. We see the same thing in the labor movement. When something bad happens and people are like, we should have a general strike, and it's like, absolutely, I would love if there was a general strike. I think general strikes are great. I think it would be really amazing if it happened, but the truth is, from my experience, we don't have the capacity to pull off a general strike in Alberta. So maybe that means we have to focus on certain sectors or on certain groups of workers or on certain things for now. So definitely just like there is going to be a lot of flex there, and I would say we maybe don't have the power yet. I feel like I'm being a bit of a downer. We maybe don't have the power yet to just be kind of saying like, absolutely everyone, like, keep your rent and don't worry about the consequences, because we don't have enough power to protect people from those consequences, and that would be irresponsible of us.
Yeah, exactly. It's like it is impossible to try to convince every person in my neighborhood to keep their rent collectively, and that interest just isn't there, and it's just not feasible. So pretty much our focus is kind of redirected into trying to find those tenants that are completely unable to pay or need to withhold it right now, and seeing how we can support them. And for the worry about credit scores when you are withholding rent, like as I said before, it's a pretty long process until your landlord takes that judgment and applies it to a credit bureau, and then it affects your rent or your credit, sorry. But if you pay the full amount owed, even before it goes to a hearing, or when you are within the 2 weeks of getting that notice, your credit rating won't be affected.
And do you think that some of the tenant organizing that's happened because of COVID will last after the pandemic?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the reason I say that is because it is tied to organizations, even new ones, even ones that don't have a ton of infrastructure or resources, that allows that type of organizing to be more durable. Obviously, I'm not suggesting that everyone has had like a road to Damascus moment with like tenants and landlords and the right to housing, but people are seeing a lot of deep-seated problems in our society right now laid really, really bare. And I think if we organize on them, we can really, really seize a specific moment here. And maybe this will counteract some of the downer things I was saying when I last answered a question about how we're not ready for like a general rent strike. Right now is we can get there if we are able to build more durable and long-lasting organizations. You know, it's not something that's a total impossibility. It's just something that takes a lot of work and a lot more people doing the work than are doing it right now.
Yeah, for sure. And like in our neighborhood, like it would be amazing for this to turn into some sort of neighborhood tenant association. Like right now, I've been talking to the senior that's pretty much facing a rent eviction, and he's paying way below less than market rate. So his landlord is trying to push him out. So even trying to organize around that and help other tenants that are facing eviction for any sort of reason would be great to do in the future.
I'll say, you know, we're seeing the same phenomenon on labor where like, you know, there's a group of workers and they like don't have PPE at work. And that's like the immediate issue they're concerned about, but you can totally leverage like organizing around that into organizing them into a durable long-term organization like a union. And I think the same thing can happen with tenants where like right now we're organizing around immediate real concerns to people. Those things can absolutely pivot into more long-lasting durable tenants associations and unions. And that is where I would really love to see a lot of work go, especially as we see more successes, fingers crossed, from this type of organizing in COVID-19.
And the last audience question, do the panelists have Twitter or social accounts that people can follow, or accounts of other people or organizations that they recommend?
Yeah, so I'm Kate L. Jacobson on Twitter, S-O-N at the end of my last name. For other organizations that I really like and have really been inspired by, the Los Angeles Tenants Union is really, really remarkable for an example of building by building, neighborhood by neighborhood organizing. They also do amazing language justice work. They do all of their meetings simultaneously in Spanish and English, which is incredible like language justice work that has allowed them to really expand the people they can talk to. Casey Tenants United in Kansas City is another big inspiration of mine. And also Living Rent, which is based in the United Kingdom. In Scotland is a really remarkable organization that they're really great because they're kind of a hybrid mix between like a more traditional like campaign lobbying oriented, but they also match that with building to building organizing. And I think it's really interesting to see how those two things can feed off of each other and are not necessarily diametrically opposed. So those are three organizations that if you're interested in this, I would really recommend looking into. Oh, also Stomp Out Slumlords in Washington, D.C. They're really great because they do real thorough recaps of all the work they're doing on their website, what worked and also what didn't work. So you can learn a lot of tactics from them, which is just like amazing resource.
And I'm not too active on posting in my personal social media, but everyone is encouraged to check out Keep Your Rent. It's for the Facebook group, it's Keep Your Rent Toronto. And I think on Twitter and Instagram, it's just Keep Your Rent. And for any sort of organizing materials, posters, FAQs, stuff like that, you could just go to keepyourrent.com. And another resource that we'd put together was also landlordsoftoronto.com, where you can learn more about corporate landlords and who the big players are in Toronto. And a lot of research went into that, so that'd be great to check out as well.
All right, once again, thank you everyone so much for attending our Rent Strikes and Tenant Power webinar. I want to give a big thank you to Marianne and Kate for joining us tonight. And one last note, the webinar was recorded and a video with closed captions will be up on our social media soon. We'll also compile all the resources mentioned into a document that will be made publicly available. So to make sure that you see the video and the document once it's up, please follow LEAP Chapter UofT on Facebook. And I hope everyone here learned a thing or two. I know I definitely did, and hope you have a wonderful night.
Good night, everyone.